tough. Yeah. I mean, well, I've been working from home for 15 years. So.
Oh, see, I only do it before COVID, I did it only part-time, but now I'm completely at home now.
Oh, yeah. Give me 1 second here. I'm just going to edit your mic a bit.
Okay.
Okay, I will try not to get distracted. My phone is off and upside down. It's 7:30 here, so I'm having a beer.
Right on.
It's a really good beer. I think you'd like it. Well, I don't know if you drink IPA or not, but
I do. Where are you? You're in Canada?
Toronto.
Okay.
Yeah.
My parent company, because I'm the public education officer for the Apothecarium, our parent company is TerraSen. It's out of Toronto.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and one of our sister companies, Valhalla, actually has a cannabis-infused IPA. There's no alcohol in it, but it's one of the first that I've tasted that actually tastes like real beer. It's kind of crazy.
Oh, yeah, that's good to know. Actually, I'm going to go off script here for a second, but I had this thought, and I'm trying to push it to the Canadian Federation of Restaurants Association, which is all the restaurants. Because obviously the restaurants have all been locked down, and they've been they're suffering. Everybody's suffering.
Oh, yeah.
So I thought, well, if we could kind of push through, like, it's weed's legal here. That's the first thing. And so are mushrooms to a lesser extent. They can buy them and stuff. But I thought, well, and when you were talking about when you were on your show the other day, talking with the chef, Dominique Kren.
Oh, yeah.
So I listened to that and I smoked a joint. And I thought, I got to get our restaurant association on so that we could sell infused food. Because I think that would be a real kick to the restaurant industry if all of a sudden they can start selling meals that are infused with cannabis.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
that might actually bring the restaurant, well, not so much the clientele, but it might really build up their restaurant sales. Because instead of making 10 meals or 4 meals at $10 each, they could make one meal at $40 and get their money back in less time.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, that was just a thought.
Here we have, when we're not in the middle of COVID, we have like a lot of infused dinners where people pay a lot of ticket to go to those.
Oh, yeah. If my kids are a bit older, every meal would be infused.
I hear that.
But they're not.
I could handle that. I think my husband probably would look like a deer caught in the headlights. He's a lightweight.
Yeah, my wife doesn't smoke at all, so I feel like I got led down the wrong path. Like the first few dates, she'd smoke with me, but then after that, oh well.
I love it. Well, my husband, when I teach my classes, I always talk about how body mass has nothing to do with tolerance, because I have a relatively high tolerance, and I know people who are more petite than I am that I work with medically. But like Jeff he's a big guy, and he's my 2-hit wonder, and he toured with the Dead. He was a member of Further, so you'd think that he'd have a higher tolerance as a result too, but it just goes to show, body chemistry is really the most telling thing.
Yeah, but I think you also do, it depends on the strain, but you can build up certain tolerances, obviously.
True. Well, and he had a higher tolerance when he was younger, but the cannabis was also a lot different too.
Yeah, a lot weaker. Well, not so much weaker, but it wasn't as perfected as it is now.
True. But I can't wait to see what happens, because I miss artisan cannabis, and I feel like we've lost a lot of that. So I'm waiting to see a lot of that come back. Oh,
yeah. Well, some of the backyard strains I've had. So I go to my dog park and I have 3 or 4 friends who we all grow. And then it's just like, it's like a bake off. Like, I grew this and I grew this and try this. It's got a hint of lemon.
I love that. I love that.
Switching back and forth. So, but hey, we're here to talk about podcasts. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do a quick introduction.
Okay.
I'm going to say this is Sara Payan, and her podcast is called Planted with Sara Payan. Is that how I pronounce everything?
Payan.
Payan or Paya?
Payan. You got it.
I'll just say Sarah. I'm sorry. And then you can go on there and give us the elevator pitch to your podcast. And then I'm going to ask you what you listen to that inspires you. We'll talk about your hardware for a minute. We'll talk about where you're hosting, what your plans are. And Bob's your uncle. We got 25 minutes to do it. So
cool. That sounds great.
Work for you?
Works for me.
All right. Hi, it's Mike from the Odd Pod, and today we are talking with Sara. Her podcast is called Planted with Sara Payan. I hope I pronounced that correctly.
You got it. That's fine.
Bad skills.
Thank you very much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
It's all yours.
Oh, hi.
Oh, I said I said I wasn't going to do the video, but tell you what, I'll cut that part out. But this way I'll leave it there.
Okay.
Chat away. This way I can see my beautiful face.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you a little bit about my podcast. My podcast is, like you said, called Planted with Sara Payan, and it's an ongoing conversation about cannabis, and it's always with an educational bent because I'm a cannabis educator, but we cover all different parts of it. We talk about the medical, we talk about policy. I had the CEO from Canopy Rivers on recently, Narbe, and we talked about investing, we talked about trends, really all these different things. And the coming year, I'm going to be having, in January, we'll be having Ngaio Bilam, who is not only an OG cannabis activist, but he's also a wonderful comedian, and that's actually his main job. So we're covering all of the areas in the wide world of cannabis in this new era of legalization, and also all around talking about too the fact that we as citizens have a responsibility to drive policy by letting our politicians know that, you know, not only do we use cannabis, but we pay taxes and we have lives and we are constructive and we vote. Because a lot of the policy that we see, especially in newer markets, is based around, in the States, state culture, which I did a lot of lecturing in other states, especially in the South. And that's when you really see that the United States is kind of like all these little countries together. They all have very distinct cultures, but it's also based on stigma. And now as we're getting into the era of legalization, we're seeing policy that's not necessarily built on serving the people well, but serving corporations well. Like when we're looking in New Jersey, where they've just passed legalization, but they're not allowing cultivation, and that's not safe access. So when people get really frustrated and they're like, you know, what can I do? I'm like, let's have some Stoner Civics 101. What can you do to get active in the government? And then when things are passed, how long does it normally take for things to come into effect? Like when we had legalization in California, we had so many people coming to the dispensary doors the day after thinking that they could walk right in and buy cannabis. And it's like, whoa. We got to set the foundation now. Now we have to have, you know, the BCC, and how are we going to trace this, you know, from seed to sale, and what is taxation going to look like, and all the different rules that come with, you know, legitimizing something, which sometimes seems like gloving up for brain surgery, but it's the truth.
Yeah, well, like I said, we're legalized here in Canada. Are you in California?
Yeah, we've had medical since the 90s, and in 2016 we passed adult use, the same time that we voted in Donald Trump. So I would have traded. I would have given it up if Trump hadn't won. I could have waited another year or so.
Yeah, I would have stayed illegal if that was a trade-off.
Yeah, wholeheartedly. But, you know, so I was one of the chairs of the San Francisco State Legalization Task Force, and we were already making recommendations around policy for San Francisco prior to legalization passing. And now I'm on the oversight committee for San Francisco, where my seat represents medical cannabis users, but also compassion programs, because cannabis is extraordinarily expensive. And I'm a stage 3 colon cancer survivor, which is why I got into cannabis. And I know that when you're critically or chronically ill, most often you have a really hard time making ends meet anyway. So we did a lot of work to pass the compassion bill so that we actually can give donations of free cannabis to people in need who are low income and sick.
That's a great idea. How would that work? Would you go to the pharmacy itself, or the I can't pronounce it, apothecary? Would you make the donation there and it's just like paying it forward, or is it a fund?
So It's funded by, it's actually donations from the companies. So we've done a lot of work engaging people in these companies to do donations. So it's free of charge, and then it's donated to a dispensary where then it's dispersed to people. So all people need to do is have proof of residency, proof of identity with government ID, and then they have to have a verifiable medical recommendation, because this is for medical users. So once they do that, the program that I put together, I actually had one years ago that we had to end once legalization started, because they didn't allow for that in legalization. We had to go back and get everything passed again. People fill out, the form. I verify everything, and once a month they get a nice box of donated flour, edibles, concentrates if they need it. We have drinks, all sorts of things. And then what they do is they come back to me with feedback and let me know how it's helping with their symptom management. But there's a lot of groups that are doing it. We have groups that are supporting veterans. We have a group like Sweet Leaf that's doing stuff all over the state and helping all sorts of people. And my colleagues, and my big challenge for the new year is to really spread it throughout California to make sure that all these people that need help get it. And especially right now with the pandemic, there's a lot of people who could really use our help.
Oh, I agree. Now, what made you start the podcast portion of this then? Do you find it's a tool to reach more people, or was it just a tool to talk to more people in the industry, or what brought it to fruition, I guess?
Well, I've been the public education officer for the Apothecarium now for 8 years. And so I do all the outward facing education. And my thing is conversation is normalization. Every time somebody comes in and has a conversation with me about cannabis and is nervous about it, I start talking to them about, you spend an afternoon in my waiting room, you would see the broad cross section of people who use cannabis. And not everybody is looking to get high, but there's nothing wrong with euphoric effects if that's what fits into your lifestyle. I know it does in mine. And just really talking about all the different aspects of it that we might not necessarily look at. I'm really active in the cannabis community, both on the policy and education side. So the podcast was just something that made sense. Like, how do we continue this conversation in a format that's accessible to more people? And it's outside of my usual educational programming, because I do classes on Zoom where people from all over the world come and listen and can ask questions. We do like Cannabis 101, Cannabis and Cancer, and all through, like right now with my biggest one is cannabis, anxiety, and depression. So that's the educational portion. But now let's talk about what's shaping cannabis culture and policy and what we're seeing, and just having it's more from like the educational advocacy standpoint. And so we've just had some really great conversations. Like one of my first episodes was with former San Francisco Mayor Art Agnos. And Art is in his 80s. And cannabis didn't do much for him when he was younger, but after having open heart surgery, I actually met with him and helped him find capsules that would help him sleep at night. And so he was just like, I got him on record for the first time talking about his cannabis use and how it should be covered by insurance and what relief it gives him. So the podcast is about normalization. Like I always say, conversation is normalization. Let's talk about this more, because the more we have conversations about, the history, how did we get here? What do we want it to look like? What opportunities do we have to change the way the world does business in many ways? Like, what about, how do we compassionately hold people? How do we talk about accessibility? And how do we get these corporations to understand that, like, the better policies that we have and the more accessible cannabis is, the better it actually is for them in the end, because we want to be looking at sustainable models to support the cannabis industry to be able to continue. It doesn't have to be about greed, and actually that's going to bite them in the ass in the end.
Well, excuse me. Those are all valid points too. And is the podcast the only tool you're using, or are you going to be going on YouTube with this as well too, or what other avenues are you going to promote the conversation?
Well, I do product education videos on YouTube. And we've been looking at, what we want to do to continue the conversation in the new year. I do a lot of, when we're not in this time of COVID, I do a lot of keynote speaking and speaking at conferences and lecturing, like 2-hour lectures. But really, like, this year has been a great opportunity to figure out other ways to engage with people that are stimulating. And I think, like, one thing we're going to do this year with the podcast, because everyone keeps saying, Sarah, you don't have a section for listeners to, ask you questions. So this year, I think what we're going to be doing is actually putting it out there. Either we'll do it live through my board or just have people send in questions and I'll answer them at the end of episodes. But that's one of the ways that we're going to create some more engagement as well.
Yeah, I was going to suggest that because I'm using this tool here called Streamyard. And it can go live and I can broadcast it to Facebook or Twitter or Twitch or whatever platform I choose to. And if you went with something like that, and you could, Facebook Live is fantastic too if you have that option to go ahead with it. Because I think, like you said, if you could get engagement, that's going to get people talking about it. One of the best things about the podcast, though, too, is that when people listen to it, they're focused on it. So they're going to download it, put it in their phone, go through their car, commute, or bicycle, or whatever way they go about it, and they're going to really stay tuned. So I think you should definitely stick with it. Thanks.
Yeah, I've gotten a lot of great support because my podcast is actually part of Radio Misfits Network out of Chicago. So they have a whole host of shows, and my producer Ed is wonderful. Like, this was my first time doing podcasts. In college, I was a radio DJ, and in my work with policy and as an educator, I've moderated a lot of panels. But this is kind of the melding of the two. And that's been really, really interesting. So Ed set me up. He sent me a board, and then it connects to a laptop, and I've got my mic set up. And then when it's done recording, he just goes in there and pulls everything and edits it and throws it up there for me. So I'm really lucky that I don't really deal with the editing portion. I just get to be the creative head of it, and I like that.
Well, that's good. I know an editor in San Francisco first was the worst, but yeah, it's good to see that it's working out for you now. And now, what are you listening to?
I've been listening to. Just the other day, I actually listened to Brene Brown, Dare to Lead, and she had a great interview with President Obama, and I really liked, he was talking about it's like authentic leadership and wholeheartedness, and just one of the things that I really learned from being sick is that kindness isn't weakness, and having conversations. Being a leader doesn't necessarily mean you have to be cold and do or die. Are you all with me? We're going to go through the fire. It's really about mentorship, and it's about service. And she talks a lot about that. But I also like when you were talking about restaurants, there's a really great podcast that I enjoy from Marcia Gagliardi, and it's called, what's it called? I wrote it down because I have chemo brain, so I forget things sometimes, but it's called On the Fly by Table Hopper. And Marcia has been doing the Table Hopper blog for I think 14 or 15 years. And so she talks to a lot of large restaurateurs, more smaller indie restaurateurs, and talking about what they're dealing with right now in the time of COVID, because she was covering restaurants and all the buzz on it before this, and now it's kind of well, we've lost, like you were saying, we've lost a lot of restaurants. It's been a really hard time for the hospitality industry, and she's she's also just my favorite foodie, so I like checking her out. She also does stuff with cannabis too. And then, of course, my network that I'm on, Radio Misfits Network, has a lot of great podcasts, but my favorite out of that is The Winemakers, and that's a podcast out of Sonoma. And two of my friends are in that. Sam Katuri, who owns winery 16600, and also John Myers, who's the host. Brian and Casey and Bart are on there. They're two, but those are my two friends, and I really enjoy how they nerd out about wine. It's a lot of fun. And then another one that friends of mine really pushed me to listen that I've just started listening to is Shit Town. Have you checked it out?
No, not. I don't think I've actually. I might have heard of it.
It's really, really good. You can look it up as S Town Podcast, but it's the guys from This American Life,
Oh
and
yeah.
it's about a town in Alabama. And then I have one more, Buddies.
Okay.
It's JP and Frank Castillo. Frank Castillo is a comedian, and JP is actually an old colleague of mine who works at a dispensary called Buds and Roses down in LA. And they get comedians high and talk. So they had like one with Josh Wolf, and they're just that's just a really fun one. Like I do a lot of serious work, and I'm always like really thinking. So it's kind of nice to have some levity. And JP is he's a total cannabis connoisseur. It's, I've watched him grow from starting out behind the bar to like having these relationships with growers and really nerding out on it. I'm just, not only is it entertaining, but I'm just so incredibly proud of him. He did a great job.
What's that one called?
That one is called Buddies with a exclamation point. And it's JP and Frank Castillo. And Frank's a comedian in LA. So they have all sorts of comedians.
Kind of like comedians in cars getting coffee, but it's like comedians in a building getting stoned.
Yeah. And JP brings the firebud.
That's good. Well, it's like that YouTube show where they eat the hot wings, the hot sauce, I guess.
Totally. Yeah, I've checked that out too. Yeah, there's a lot of fun, and they're just silly. They're very silly.
Yeah. Side note: I used to work for an alternative newspaper here in Toronto called Now. Really big, like it's one of Canada's biggest. And I was their IT guy. But we had like this whole, there's a big cannabis culture behind it. Yeah. But I remember my friend, she wanted to start making a YouTube series called Baked with Tamar, because her name was Tamar, and she just wanted to do cannabis cooking. Mm-hmm. So we started it, but YouTube wouldn't let us put it up there due to the adult content. So we're trying to find sponsors for it. But it was just a cooking show about cooking cannabis. Oh my God. But every day, not every day, but every week pretty much, we got so stoned.
I love it.
Yeah, the whole office.
I really hope that it gets better with like social media and cannabis, because people get a lot of followers and then all of a sudden, for whatever reason, they lose their accounts.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. And no one really owns it. It's not like it's an NPR version of social media. There's gotta. It's owned by a company to make money. If there was someone there willing to take a loss, then maybe they'd have more rights and freedoms on it for open speech, I guess. I'm just rambling off the top of my head here, but
they could make a lot of money though with people like promoting their stuff, as long as they make sure that it's not to children. I totally get that, because kids, young people shouldn't be using cannabis unless they have to use it medicinally, with growing minds and everything. Like, I always like to make sure that people know that, you go, when a dispensary comes into town, that your children actually have less of a chance of getting their hands on cannabis, because they're not going to let them through the door at a dispensary.
I agree. Now, going back to your cancer, have you beaten it, or is it still old? Or
I'm 10 years out. So I was 37. So I was really young for getting colon cancer, but it runs in my family. And my mom is a cancer researcher. She actually did the clinical trials. And because of her, I knew I could use cannabis to help with like my nausea and eating. And I mean, I had experimented with it all through college and high school and smoked as an adult occasionally, but never really understood like all the wonderful things it can do. But, also part of my job as an educator, as we get into legalization and people are making all these claims like it's a panacea and it'll save the world. It's like, oh, dude, no. There are limitations. It does a lot of great stuff, but like, on one hand, I'm like, talking about the stigma and how, it was racially and industrially motivated that we had prohibition to begin with. But now it's like, it's not going to cure COVID. So let's stop talking about that.
Yeah. And you don't want to share a joint either.
No, puff, puff, don't pass.
Exactly. Yeah. That was, I have a few friends who are like that, and I'm like, no, it's roll your own, bring your own.
Yeah.
Keep your distance.
That's it. Well, now, I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
That's okay. Your turn. It's all about you.
Oh, I was just going to say, even before COVID, if it was somebody I didn't know, I was always kind of like, I know you're going to think that I'm stingy, but it's really not about that. I just don't want to catch a cold.
I always carry enough for two.
Yeah. I'm always down for sharing,
Yeah.
if I've got extra.
Yeah. Going back to the podcast portion, though, do you remember when you first made your podcast? Like, were you nervous when you did that for the first time, or?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely was nervous because I wasn't sure what to expect. I mean, I'm a jazz singer, and so I remember what it was like the first time I heard my voice recorded, and it like freaked me out. So I was kind of wondering if I was going to have, you get a little self-conscious, but I made sure to choose my first guest with someone I was really comfortable with. She's my editor at Cannabis Now, Ellen Holland. And so Ellen and I can talk forever and nerd out about all sorts of stuff. Like we go deep in our cannabis nerdiness. So this was before I moved in with my husband, and I had a dining room in my place in San Francisco. So we just had the recording equipment on the dining room. She and I smoked a bowl, and then we just sat there and talked. And it was actually really nice, but it takes a while to get into your groove, for sure, because the first time I was so nervous that I forgot to have her, to thank her for being on and have her give her, media tags and everything. And I was like, okay, we're done. This is good. So every episode I still learn. I mean, I feel like we can always improve things and look at different ways of doing stuff, especially because you don't want things to get stale. But every episode I always learn something from. It always reminds me of something that I should change for the next time. Not in a super critical way, but in a, oh, cool. Like, I know that my episode with Dominique, I wouldn't have been ready to do that when I first started doing the podcast. Like, I have a lot of acquaintances and friends that are really well known, that I wouldn't have felt comfortable having in the first year, because I wanted to get into my stride and make sure that I was using the most out of the time to be as productive as possible. So I chose people that I felt really comfortable with, that I could relate to, and that, had some really interesting messages to give to people that they might not have thought of before. And now, as I've been getting more comfortable with it, the one thing that I want to be cognizant of is making sure that I get people on that I don't necessarily agree with, to have some interesting conversations. Yeah. So it's a work in progress, but I've enjoyed every moment of it, especially like I said, like I'm always curious about people, but I have a theater and music background. And then, more recently I have a civil rights background. So it's like being able to kind of cobble all those things together to curate a podcast and talk to people and keep people engaged. And like with Dominique, I'd never had a conversation with her before. So it was really, and being that, she's Dominique Crenn, she's, the top female chef in the United States. And like when Jeremiah Tower, who's a big chef in the Bay and in the nation, heard that she's on the podcast, he's like, yeah, I'm not as good as she is. And he's an icon, so I don't want to waste her time. So to have her now, when I'm more comfortable with it and like really knowing how to engage people and figure out what they'll be interested in talking about, that was a big step for me. It was a lot of fun, and I learned a lot.
Now, does the Radio Misfits share the numbers with you?
I can ask him for them, and I hadn't the first year because I was afraid to. Because I was like, I know it's a slow roll, but I know that our demographics were pretty much 50-50 male to female, and we're looking at ages between like 25 and 45 is my biggest. Actually, no, 25 and 55 is my range. So it's a broad range of ages, and there's just a little bit more women than men listening, and it's probably because, Girl Squad and all that.
But well, yeah, a female host talking about cannabis is going to take it from the 420, jokester, to something a bit more serious and interesting for it. Like, especially if you're an educator, working it, like if you're an educator with like an educator background, you're pushing the show that way, I think that's going to appeal to, well, an older, more educated audience, I imagine.
Yeah, and I definitely, just like with my classes, like I get a lot of, in my classes I get a lot of people from all over, but I get a lot of R&D and a lot of like people in corporate cannabis that attend my classes because they want to know what I'm doing. I am more, not the stodgy side of cannabis, but the more serious side of it, I guess. I mean, I like to have fun with it too, but I think we've got a lot of that. You know, we have a lot of that rich, fun culture and the stoner culture already in our podcasts, in our media. And I think we need other things too to kind of round it out. You know,
Seth
we're
Rogen is
going
a
at
guest.
Seth. I'd love to get Seth. Actually, Seth had, I've been really curious to try out his cannabis brand Houseplant, and that's definitely somebody that I would love to have on.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's Snoop and then there's Seth.
Yeah.
I'd be happy hanging with either one of them.
Oh, totally. Yeah, I totally would be too. It would be, they'd be different conversations, but both would be equally as high.
But now, why isn't there a female version of Seth Rogen? I guess Sarah Silverstone or Sarah Silverman. She's not really an advocate, though. I don't think.
No,
I think she's a user. I don't think she's an advocate, though.
No, but she's cool. Like a few years back, what was it? Like 8 years back, she actually came to the store because she was a grand marshal for Pride, and we had a Sarah Silverman haze, and she came in and said hey and took pictures with us, and she was really cool. I think, you know, Chelsea Handler is starting to get into it much more. She's become more of an advocate, but it is a weird thing. Like when I first started working in cannabis, I started out behind the bar, and I was one of two females behind the bar because we were a little, I mean, there were other dispensaries that had women behind the bar, but it was a different scene. It was more, how do I say this? And I never want to put another sister down. It was more sexualized at other dispensaries where we were more serious. And I'm always like, girl, do whatever you want that makes you happy. Like, I'm not going to shame anybody, but that's not my style. And so, you know, it's a weird thing. Like it is, cannabis for a long time outwardly has been more masculine, but when we look at like the nurturing aspects of it and the medicinal aspects, there have been a lot of really awesome women that have been involved, and especially behind the scenes. So it can be a little testosterone heavy, which, hey, I like guys. I have a lot of guy friends. I don't have any issues with that, but I do think that there need to be more women that are not only doing stuff with business, but also on the media end, getting more involved. We got a lot of great women in PR and marketing, but as far as faces in cannabis, there isn't as much of that.
Yeah, well, I think you're fitting the bill fairly well. Like, I mean, with your unfortunate exposure to cancer, I mean, that it kind of turned you around and opened you up to using cannabis as, well, to help, I guess, to assist with the pain.
Yeah, it helped me. It got me eating again. It helped with pain. I have peripheral neuropathy from chemo that I deal with even now, and I use that instead of opiates. I use a 2-to-1 CBD to THC.
Right.
But like, I'm lucky because I have been looking for work that feeds my soul for a long, long time. And that's why I left corporate, because I used to work in IT and corporate. And then I was an operations manager for many years. And I went into nonprofit, and then I went into civil rights. And I really wanted something that every moment of the day would mean something to me, because I didn't want to just get a check. And it was cool, I mean, because I helped support all these great attorneys do their work. I helped keep the lights on, but I didn't get to do the direct service that I didn't realize till later I really wanted to do. So my experience with cannabis actually brought me to my heart's work, because I'm completely obsessed with all the different facets of it and how we can bridge the gap. Like, I had somebody come in once who was really nervous about it. She didn't want cannabis, but she'd gone through four years of treatment for breast cancer. And she had neuropathy that was really bothering her, and none of the pharmaceuticals were working. So her doctor told her to try cannabis, and she didn't even want anyone to know that she was going to be there. And this is a story that I tell quite often because it's one of the most poignant ones. So I sent her home with a tincture that was 18 parts CBD to 1 part THC, and I told her how to use it. And I said it would probably help her with her anxiety. And she's like, I'm not anxious. And she was with her son. And, you know, like sometimes we know our parents more than they know themselves because we've been there the whole time. And he's like, yeah, you are, you know. So she calls me like a few days later and she's like, there's my girl. And I'm like, wow, that's different. You know, she's like, this has helped. This is the first thing that's helped with the pain. You know, I still have numbness, but the burning's gone. And I didn't realize that I was kind of anxious, and this has helped me relax. And I'm so mad that the stigma made me afraid of trying this for so long. And she's a retired pharmaceutical salesperson. And it's like, you know, she's like, I need to talk to my peers. I'm like, you should talk to your peers. Like, that's the biggest thing. People listen to their peers. We listen to stories. We listen to experiences. But then the thing is how does it work with your body? So when I always tell people in my classes, if you come to my class, you read a book, you check out some really great research, you're going to get a generalization about how the majority of human beings respond to cannabis. And now we want to create a safe container for experimentation so you can figure out how it actually works with you. And that's really important because I've seen thousands of people. I have over 16,000 hours of experience with human beings in cannabis, and I've seen some pretty wacky stuff, and a lot of it has to do with, you know, our nervous systems. And so I think that, like, you know, it's like going back to cannabis is not a panacea, and cannabis, like looking at it, like when we're looking at critical thought or being more in touch with our bodies, with how whatever we put in our bodies, how it reacts, because that's empowerment. When we're looking at, you know, business models around cannabis, like how can we be more compassionate in our business and be prosperous? How can we create better policies that serve the people? How can we get people more engaged in policy making? And nothing gets a person more active than finding a subject that they're interested in and seeing everything that's attached to it. Like when I first taught classes at City College, San Francisco, and we were talking about the possibility of a cannabis associate degree. And I was saying, do you understand, like, people who are passionate about cannabis, how that gets people interested in things like biochemistry or systems or, you know, botany? I mean, everyone's going to say botany. But there are also all these other things that are connected to it. And it's like, if you love cannabis and you're good at accounting, you might love being a cannabis accountant.
Yeah, well, our local school, one of the colleges offers, well, there's several that offer the cannabis growers course.
Yeah.
And since it's legal here and there's a lot of growers, it's where they hire from. It's really interesting. But listen, Sarah, I've taken up a lot of your time. I appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for having me.
To you again.
I'd love to, yeah.
Yeah, maybe in 6-7 months, we'll see how things are going. We'll see how the pandemic's going. But in the meantime, where can people find you online?
So you can find us online. If you want to listen to the podcast, my website is www.plantedwithsara.com. On Facebook, we are Planted with Sara. Also on Instagram, we're Planted with Sara. Twitter is Planted with Sara. And then we are on Stitcher, Spotify, Pandora, Apple, Google, and Amazon. So just about anywhere where you listen to podcasts, you can find Planted with Sara Payan. And our next episode, we usually do 2 episodes a month, but we're doing 1 this month since the later part of the month, everyone's busy. And, you know, you'll have to catch up on an extra episode next month then. So we're going to start off January with Ngayo Bilam. And he is a hilarious comedian, but he's also, like I mentioned earlier, an OG activist. So he, like, New Jack hair, and, you know, we're going to have a lot of really fun stuff to talk about and some really intense conversations about social justice this time around too.
Okay, well, I'm really looking forward to it. I'll probably get this episode up in early to mid-January.
Okay, well then it'll probably be up by then. And then, you know, check it out and let me know what you think.
Okay, well, listen, I appreciate your time, Sarah. We'll touch base again. Okay. I'm going to hit end broadcast right now, but just stay on just for a second.
Sure.